Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Double Take, Preserving Portraits of War. My name is Kelly Skeen, and I am an interpretation specialist at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This afternoon, we gratefully acknowledge the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here, the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we are gathered, and the labor of people who were enslaved in constructing the historic building that houses the American Art Museum today. It's a pleasure to be with you and present this installment of our Double Take series. This series brings together experts from the American Art Museum into conversation with scholars from across the Smithsonian to reveal the unexpected connections between American art and nearly every other subject we cover here at the Smithsonian, from history to anthropology, astronomy to zoology. Today, we'll be exploring the link between art and military service. Since 1986, Kate Maynor has been the paper conservator at SAAM, where she cares for a diverse collection of graphic arts and contributes to the varied outreach programs of the Lender Conservation Center. Watercolor is Kate's favorite artistic medium, one she enjoys using in her conservation work at the museum, as well as when she sketches outdoors. And this special edition of Double Take features our partner organization, the American Battle Monuments Commission. Ben Brands is a historian for the ABMC and a PhD candidate at George Mason University. He previously served for a decade as an infantry officer in the United States Army and has taught military history at the United States Military Academy at West Point and Oregon State University. Kate and Ben, thanks so much for joining us today. We are really looking forward to this conversation. So we are going to begin the program by exploring the kind of focused artwork together. And so this work that we're looking at today is by artist Claggett Wilson, and it is titled Flower of Death, the bursting of a heavy shell, not as it looks, but as it feels and sounds and smells. First, I invite you to spend 30 seconds or so looking quietly at the image. Let your eyes wander. Direct your gaze to a part of the image you haven't yet seen or focused on. Pick a new detail to spend our last couple of seconds of close looking to really hone in on. Now that you've had some time to look at the artwork, I'm going to ask everyone to join me in making observations about it. Starting with Kate and Ben, attendees, I encourage you to answer using the Q&A box. I'll start us off with asking, what do you see?
Well, the first thing I see are those incredibly bright, bursting, and hot colors. And I see the contrast between those and the white area in the center and those dark exploding particles.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, in addition to color, line is used really powerfully here. You have the very straight lines radiating out from the center of that burst. And then you have kind of elsewhere in the painting, you have curved lines kind of curving away from the explosion and showing some of the force of it. And I think, that's used pretty effectively here.
Great. A participant is also noting that they see an explosion and they see barbed wire in the top left of the image. Another participant is noting the strong yellow and orange colors that are drawing their eyes across the artwork.
Yeah, and I'm always, personally, when I look at this, I'm always drawn initially to the explosion, but then as I look around, I find the human figures at the bottom left, another very fascinating part of this painting, and the use of curve there and kind of a bit of an abstraction to those figures.
Yeah, I see a difference between the left and the right sides of the picture, and my eyes keep going back and forth. It seems there's action on one side and there's a little bit more stillness on the other side, and then again, like Ben said, my eyes go down to the figures and I start to notice those and their shapes, and I'm curious about what's going on down there in that corner.
I'm curious too about the figures in that bottom corner. I'm unsure if it's one figure and sort of like multiple representations of that figure, maybe representing some kind of fraught emotion or tension, or whether it's two people.
Yeah, I've always felt that it was two people, but that's an interesting idea. I've looked at this painting dozens of times, and I never really thought about, is this capturing multiple moments? Because for me, the power of this has always been capturing that, very specific instant of the burst of the shell.
And I
What
see
else do you think of? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
I was going to say that I see a variety of scale in the shapes. Initially, of course, we're looking at that explosion, but then that large kind of triangular shape in the bottom corner is very impactful. And it really contrasts with, if your eye moves diagonally, it really contrasts with the more delicate work of the barbed wire and the other shapes in the top left corner.
Another participant is noting that they're seeing the force of the explosion indicated by holes in the shrapnel that ripped into the object at the bottom right. So you can see that kind of large piece of what looks like metal, and the light coming through the holes there. One of the participants is also asking, what is that black thing in the bottom corner?
Yeah, and I would say, coming to this as a military historian rather than an artist or an art historian, I always try to start sorting this into what I would recognize from, actual history. And so, I see, the wall of the trench, it looks like the shell is exploding inside the trench. You see the barbed wire, that would have been the obstacle. So that side of the trench is the direction the enemy is in. That's where the barbed wire obstacles and other obstacles are. And then that shape in the bottom right, I've always, thought it was perhaps duckboard, which is, World War I trenches, because they're below ground, would fill with water. And so if they had enough time, soldiers would line the bottom of the trenches with what was called duckboard, wooden planks, basically a plank road to keep them out of the mud. And I've always kind of thought that's what that was, but I did a little bit more research since last week. And a lot of these trenches, the more permanent ones, they would also use corrugated metal to hold up the walls. And so I think it's one of those two things, but it's part of the trench that's been peeled back by the force of the explosion.
Thanks, Ben. A couple other observations from audience members. One is noting that they see two people, one in gray clothing and one in blue, and it looks like maybe the person in the gray clothing was thrown into the person in the blue clothing. Another person noticed that I think the bottom left is a man and his dog. The man is mostly bare. So some interesting observations coming in here, and making me wonder lots of things. So I wanted to ask, what do you wonder about what is happening here? What questions do you have?
Well, I did wonder if one of those two, I see two figures in the bottom left corner, and I wondered why one of them appears to be shirtless. And if that is something that is realistic and something that actually could have happened, or is this the artist using that as a design element? And I wondered too about the gradation of brown colors in what I assume is a dirt bank in the left-hand side. And once again, it's interesting to think about artist choices. Is that realistic, or is it purposeful, or is it a design element?
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating too, because I think it's a little bit of both, right? Like there's certainly some artistic license here, in the way the various brown striping is on what I assume is this trench wall. And part of that is to give kind of a contrast between the very muted colors outside the explosion and the very bright, powerful colors in the explosion. But I mean, also, for me, I think there's an element of this gets to the fact that World War I combat was continuous, and it wasn't way some earlier wars. There was no break. And so you might have an artillery barrage that comes in while you're doing your personal hygiene. And so someone might be, out of their equipment with their shirt off, feeling fairly safe in their trench, shaving for the day, or laundering their uniform that they might only have one or two of. And suddenly there's an explosion because there is no kind of break. And so I think, that's an interesting way to think about this painting as well, and Claggett Wilson and what he's shown here.
Thanks. We have a couple more questions coming in from the audience about the artwork. One participant wonders whether this is an event the artist experienced personally, while another asks, how common was it for shells to get far enough to fall in the trenches of either side? What was the experience for soldiers like when that happened? And those are some great questions that I think both of our experts here are going to dig into a little bit further. So with that, thank you for generating all this curiosity about the artwork. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Kate, to tell us more about the artist Claggett Wilson and his World War I watercolors.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I would like to start with a few general comments about art conservation before I move into the watercolors more specifically. So if you could go back one slide, please. So what is art conservation? Many of you are undoubtedly familiar with the term restoration, but that term refers more specifically to those procedures that return an artwork to aesthetic or even physical wholeness. Professional art conservation, on the other hand, encompasses a much broader range of responsibilities, and conservators undergo very lengthy multidisciplinary training in order to meet those responsibilities. Our work begins with examination. We use a variety of visual and technical means in order to determine the materials, techniques, and condition of artworks. It's important for us to distinguish between those conditions that are stable versus those conditions that are ongoing and may require some intervention. We document our examination and our treatments in permanent written and photographic records so that all this information is available for future caretakers. We may use a variety of analytical instruments or techniques in order to further explore an artist's materials or his methods. Our conservation treatments are designed to stop or to slow down any damage or deterioration, and sometimes we restore aesthetics or functionality. Sometimes our treatments can be very obvious in before and after comparisons, and other times they are almost invisible. Lastly, preventive care is an important part of conservation because we would prefer to prevent damage or deterioration to begin with. And you see an example of us monitoring the light levels in the galleries. Next slide. I became involved with Claggett Wilson's watercolors when the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art requested 12 paintings from us for their major 2016 exhibition titled World War I in American Art. You see Wilson here in uniform. He was an academically trained artist and an art teacher who served in France during the war. These examples show Wilson's typical themes: the damage that war inflicts on human minds and bodies and on nature. And they're rendered in a style that's both realistic and expressionistic. These works are actually recreations from memory that the artist had to do because the original versions that he painted after the armistice in Germany were lost during transport back to the US. The 23 paintings in the portfolio came to the American Art Museum in 1981. Next slide. This is the dynamic work that launched our program today. And when approaching watercolors, I first assess characteristics and condition of the paints in the paper. For example, are the colors faded? Are they still soluble in water? Are they absorbent? Is the paper very absorbent? Flower of Death is very typical of the materials, techniques, and condition of all of Wilson's paintings. Wilson used a variety of commercial illustration boards, and these generally have very good quality facing papers. His technique involves a graphite underdrawing with layers of watercolor washes, sometimes with additions of black ink and even a bit of varnish. This image is taken in raking light, which is light that comes in at a very low angle and from the left. And it reveals textural differences and surface qualities. And you're looking at a thin, relatively flat paperboard that had some slight distortions on the back. In the image at the left of the front of the artwork, notice that there's a very faint patch of blue in the top left corner. This was something that I had to notice and pay attention to in treatment. It was actually movement of the original watercolor from the water-based adhesive that was applied in the past. There was also a 4.5-inch diagonal break in the top left, or the top right corner of the artwork. And you'll see this better in a later detail. In the image on the right, you're seeing evidence of several campaigns of previous mounting. Dark paper remnants, several adhesives, 2 different adhesives, in fact. The discolored yellow adhesive was very cracked and was actually pulling up the paper fibers. Next slide. After surface cleaning the back of the artwork, we tested a variety of techniques in order to remove the water-soluble adhesives. A steam tool was especially effective because it involves heat and moisture. We also used poultices of a water-based gum called methyl cellulose. And this is also an adhesive that we use in conservation. And it's especially effective because it allows for very slow and gradual wetting. Next slide. This painting, with its very terse but descriptive title, is notable for being the first and perhaps one of the only depictions of shell shock, a term that was coined during the war and which we now know as PTSD. The surface cleaning and adhesive removal for this work were especially challenging because there were so many artists' inscriptions and little sketches on the back. You see the results of treatment in the details on the right. We were able to surface clean around those inscriptions using custom cut little slivers of white plastic eraser, and we also used gentle cosmetic sponges. And we used the same adhesive removal techniques that I showed you previously. A little bit of staining from the adhesive did remain, but we decided it wasn't important to push this further, given that this was the back of the artwork. Next slide, please. The final treatment for Flower of Death was repairing and inpainting that break in the top right corner. After reinforcing the area on the back, a very thin layer of methyl cellulose, that same adhesive, was applied in the crack to set down the bare paper fibers and provide an isolating layer. Then new light fast paints were applied in the crack using a very small brush, similar to the one that you see on the right. Next, please. For mending, we use Japanese paper generally because it's very lightweight and it's very strong and it has exceptionally long fibers. And you can see those in the image on the left. The long fibers are teased out when we tear that paper along a wetted line. Our adhesive of choice is generally a cooked wheat starch paste, which is very stable, non-acidic, and also reversible. It stays really strong, even though we can dilute it quite a bit. Next, please. And this is Flower of Death, the front after treatment. And the work of cleaning the back was completed. Several small losses along the border were inpainted, and the crack that I showed you in the top right corner was also repaired and inpainted. Next slide. The final step for these works before display is matting and framing. And this is an example of preventive care, housing the watercolors for storage and for display. So we choose the highest quality materials that are durable and stable. And we consult with our curators and our exhibition staff about aesthetics so that we can maximize the impact of these artworks. The mat board that we use is made from 100% cotton fibers, and it's generally an alkaline mat board. The hinging materials are similar to the ones I mentioned previously, the Japanese paper and wheat starch paste. And when we frame these artworks, we ensure that there is sufficient space between the surface of the artwork and the glazing. So now I'd like to invite Ben to continue the conversation and to talk a little bit more about World War I.
Thank you, Kate. So as Kelly said, my name is Ben Brands, and I'm a historian with the American Battle Monuments Commission, or ABMC. ABMC is a small federal agency, and our mission is to administer America's overseas military monuments and cemeteries, mostly World War I and World War II. And today, ABMC administers 26 cemeteries and 32 monuments spread across 17 countries. And so you might be asking what this has to do with art. And I would say there's really two answers there. One, I'm a military historian by training, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about World War I today and how that affected Claggett Wilson and impacted his art. And also, if we're talking about preservation today, ABMC's mission is really preservation. It's preserving these sites in perpetuity to honor those who are buried there. And then secondly, we use, art in those sites. And I would argue that our preservation also extends to preserving the memory of those who are buried and honored at our sites. So to start with, I'll talk a little bit about World War I and why it's important to us today. And I'm not going to go blow by blow through the war, but I do think what's important to understand is what a shock this war was. And it was a shock in a couple of different ways. And that, I think, comes through in art in general from this period, but specifically for Claggett Wilson, who experienced the war personally. And so, when World War I breaks out, it's a bit of a shock because Europe had been at peace for over 40 years since the wars of German unification. And while at the same time there was this, process of universal military service and mobilization and railroads that inspired, the desire to, in the event of hostilities, pull the trigger first on mobilizing your army, which combined with these entangled opposing alliance systems kind of made Europe a powder keg. There was simultaneously a feeling that maybe Europe had finally evolved past, its nature as constant warfare that had marked most of its history. And so when war breaks out in 1914, it's a huge shock to the continent, and especially to those who participate. And then the second way it's a shock is the way the war is conducted. The changes in technology and the way armies were organized make this war very different from what we see in preceding periods. All wars are terrible, but in some ways World War I was uniquely terrible. And that had a huge impact on, really the entire world, but specifically on those who participated in it. And while we call it a world war, it was mostly fought in Europe. There was some fighting in the colonies, but for the most part, this was fought on the European mainland. And actually in America, until American entry in 1917, it was referred to as the European War. And so if you go to the next slide, this war is also a bit of a shock for America specifically, because it's really the first breaking of America's kind of splendid isolation. And so, yes, we'd had the Spanish-American War 15 years before, but that was so small in duration, so small in size, and close to America that it really didn't make a break the way that World War I did. In the entire Spanish-American War, you had 2,500 casualties. World War I is an entirely different scale. When World War I breaks out, the American army consists of 127,000 soldiers. By the end of the war, there's 4 million Americans in uniform, and 2 million of those have served in Europe. Next slide. The war is also a shock in the way it's conducted. Trench warfare becomes the primary mode of operation in this war, and indecisive battles last months and cost casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Meuse-Argonne campaign, which is America's portion of the 100 Days campaign that ends the war, it lasts for 47 days. 1.2 million Americans participate in it, and over 26,000 Americans are killed just in this one campaign. And so this was a shocking experience for those involved. Also, technology had changed the nature of war in ways that made it, horrific, impersonal, but still viscerally personal for the people it was inflicted on. Artillery has advanced to the stage where artillery becomes the #1 killer. 60% of people killed in World War I are killed by artillery. In comparison, America's last major war before this, the American Civil War, 20% of those killed are killed by artillery. And this change has a huge impact. And we see that in what effect that has on Claggett Wilson with his use of the bursting shell in this painting, but it makes war kind of impersonal and, random in a way that might have felt a little bit different if you were engaging directly with an enemy you could see. You also have the introduction of gas, which, while it's not, operationally very effective, doesn't change the outcome of the war or even specific battles for the most part, is a horrific experience for those who undergo it. And Claggett Wilson is marked by this. Claggett Wilson serves as a Marine in World War I, sorry. And the Marines there, they sent 2 regiments overseas. First time the Marines fight as kind of a second land army, if you will. They are put into the 2nd Division of the Army, and they serve throughout the war, specifically at Belleau Wood, where on June 6, 1918, one of the opening battles of the war for the Americans, the Marines lose more killed in that one afternoon, than in their previous existence back to 1775. And so this is a searing experience for the Marines. Wilson goes on to serve, because of his French ability, serve on division staff. And I've always kind of found this an interesting connection for me, is that when I was in the Army, I was also in 2nd Infantry Division. And so you can see on my wall here, I've got my guide on from when I commanded a company in the same division that Claggett Wilson served in. But Wilson is marked by his experience in the war. He's wounded twice, he's gassed, he never fully recovers from the experience of that. And I think, he channels that into his paintings that he drafts during the war and after the war. And if we go to the next slide, I talk about the scale of this war being different. 116,000 Americans die in World War I. And that's mostly covered in 6 months of combat, from the end of May 1918 to the beginning of November 1918, which, to lose that many men that fast is a very searing experience for the country. And it's especially searing for those who experience it. As those men die during the war, they're buried close to where they fall in temporary cemeteries by the Graves Registration Service. And you can see here some of these temporary burials. And then in the top right, that's a diary from a GRS member recording where bodies had been buried so they could find them after the war was over. And by the end of the war, there's 2,300 temporary cemeteries spread all across Europe, following the battle lines wherever Americans fought. And after the war is over, America has to decide what to do with those dead. Our allies, the British, make the decision early to leave all of the dead where they fell. And they don't bring any of the bodies home, with the exception of one unknown soldier. And in America, there's a huge debate about what to do. There's a debate. Many people strongly believe that every American should be brought home to their family. Other Americans believe that every American fallen should stay in Europe, buried permanently there, as a marker of America's contribution to this war and its role in this war. And eventually what America decides is the American government decides that each next of kin will be given a choice. And so each next of kin who lost a soldier in the war is given a choice between repatriation of their loved one's remains to the United States, or to have their loved one permanently interred in a military cemetery overseas. They'll be cared for in perpetuity by the United States government. And about 40% of families choose overseas interment, with 31,000 bodies being put into 8 permanent cemeteries. Next slide. Simultaneously, America is thinking about how to memorialize this war and commemorate it. And so in 1923, the American Battle Monuments Commission is created with the mandate of building a series of monuments in Europe to honor the achievements of the American Expeditionary Forces. On the photo left here, you can see General John J. Pershing, who was the commander of the AEF during the war, is selected as the first chairman of ABMC. And here he's standing at the temporary cemetery at Ramon, which becomes Musée. And then on the other side, you can see one of the monuments, Montfaucon Monument, under construction. And so we are given the mission of building the monuments. Shortly thereafter, given the mission of building permanent chapels at the cemeteries, and then shortly thereafter, the mission of administering these cemeteries in perpetuity. And so if you go to the next slide, the World War I program results in the 8 permanent cemeteries and 11 monuments and 2 markers spread across Europe. On the left here, we have Montsec, which is one of the monuments that we build. And on the right is Ain-Marne American Cemetery. And at the bottom right of that, you can see those woods. That's Belleau Wood, where the Marines fought in June of 1918 and where Claggett Wilson fought. Next slide. And so one of the things I want to talk about as well is our use of art. And so we use a lot of art at our sites, both our cemeteries and our monuments, and much of it takes the form of classical images. We also use, to a lesser extent, contemporary stuff, and it's interesting to see them together. And so on the left here, you have the chapel doors at Ain Marn, and you can see over the doors, there's a figure of a crusader. The capitals of the columns on either side of the door are marked by doughboys in various contemporary wartime actions. And then on the right, Chateau Thierry monument, you have the figures of Columbia and Marianne representing symbolically America and France allied in this fight. And we use this kind of classical imagery because it provides a universality to these sites. Contemporary images could represent a specific unit or a specific individual. By using these very symbolic figures, it allows us to provide meaning to accompany the sacrifice that is represented by the grave plots at these cemeteries. If you go to the next slide, here's another example of art. This is one of the mosaics at one of our chapels. This is Suresnes. And then we also have at many of our sites battle maps that depict the actual combat operations the Americans participated in. And so to the sacrifice represented by the grave plots and the meaning provided by art, we add this kind of idea of recording the historical accomplishments of the men that are fallen and are buried here. Next slide. And finally, what I want to close on is that we view our cemeteries themselves as art. And so each cemetery is deliberately designed with all these different elements, the horticulture, the grave plots, the memorial architecture, to work together to make that site a very powerful place of memory and remembrance and honor and sacrifice. And so we see art being critical to our mission in preserving the memory of these men and women. So if you go to the next slide, I want to go back to where we started, which is Claggett Wilson's work. And so we have here the Flower of Death. We also, on the right-hand side, is one of our monuments. This is the Marine Monument at Belleau Wood, which was erected in the 1950s. It's actually erected by the Marine Corps, not ABMC. We take control of it once it's completed. But it honors the Marine Brigade that fought there. It's actually located in Belleau Wood. It's surrounded by trenches and remnants of the fighting. You can see some of the German artillery that's been captured behind it. And I like to look at these pieces because, they both represent an experience at Belleau Wood. And one of the things I like to think about when I look at these is, which of these actually feels more representative of the experience of fighting in these woods. And so Kate, I'll start you off with that question and we'll transition into kind of our discussion period.
It's a great question. And I could see where standing at the monument in Belleau Wood in front of a larger than life-size sculpture of a soldier that's very representational would maybe immediately feel more realistic and allow one to recreate that experience. And yet at the same time, that perhaps strikes me as more of an outer reality, and maybe the Claggett Wilson painting strikes me as more of an inner reality. Yeah,
I think if you hit on some great stuff there, right? Like looking at the Marine Monument, which, by the way, was done by the same artist, Felix de Weldon, who did the Marine Corps Memorial in DC, the famous Iwo Jima statues. You look at it and of course, they're very realistic, right? Realistic period clothing, but for some reason we're returning to this, why is this dude shirtless? And I can see someone being shirtless in a trench for the Claggett Wilson piece, but I'm doubting there were very many Marines charging shirtless through Belleau Wood. And I think I'd go back to, the title of this piece, right? Flower of Death, bursting with a heavy shell, not as it looks, but as it feels, sounds, and smells. And obviously, watercolor can't convey a feel, smell, and sound, but I think, it does, right? And I think I would argue that in many ways, Claggett Wilson's piece feels more real to me of what that feel would have been, if not the actual, visual. And I think there's an element here as well that Claggett Wilson's, his piece is partially him working through his own experience and trauma, whereas the target of the Marine Monument is for visitors, right? To help interpret meaning for visitors, not necessarily people that experienced it.
Yes, the Wilson piece seems as though it's about an inner processing and an outer presenting. And perhaps the monument is a little less so of an inner process. Let's take a look at the next slide. Ben and I had the chance to stand in front of Flower of Death recently when I invited him to come to our graphic arts storage area. And it was wonderful for me to see it for the first time in a number of years. But Ben, I'm wondering, again, like, how did you react to seeing it in person for the first time?
Yeah, so it was great. Such a great experience to go see it, because I've, talked about this painting several dozen times probably over the past 2 years, but it's always been a PowerPoint slide. And so to see it in person was very powerful, and know that, Claggett Wilson, who I already have this kind of one-off connection with because we served in the same unit, that I was actually being able to stand next to his actual painting that he had done with his own hands. It was a little bit smaller than I expected, which is, I think, a lot of people's reactions to artwork. But it still seemed very powerful, and it was very powerful to be there with it. And I noticed things that I'd never noticed before. I noticed if you look at the barbed wire, it's got these artsy little curly cues at the end of the barbed wire where it's been peeled back that actually match how Claggett Wilson signs his G's in his name, which is a fun, touch that I never would have probably noticed on a PowerPoint.
And I hadn't noticed it either. So it's just a demonstration of how we can always go back to a work of art, and we can ask ourselves, what are you seeing now? What are you noticing?
Yeah, so Kate, what did you find most striking after, not seeing this for, gosh, 5 years, over 5 years?
Yeah, it's not since it left in 2016. I think once again, it was that contrast, the contrast of values within that painting that really struck me. It can be something of an admonition to watercolorists to be very careful with using black, because it's so dark and it can be somewhat deadening, quote unquote. But I think in this case, with Wilson combining both the watercolor medium and some carefully applied black ink, I think it not only conveys maybe the reality of things that are burnt in that explosion, but it just adds to the power of the painting, and it's skillful and very effective.
Yeah, so you've talked a bit today about paper conservation, which is your main role at SAAM. But what do you learn about artists when you work on their work, when you work on conserving their work?
Let's take a look at the next slide. This work is an example of a particularly elaborate treatment that was done a number of years ago by a very skilled intern. And this is another watercolor painting by the American artist Henry Ossawa Tanner. And it did involve a fair amount of restoration. I mentioned earlier that restoration can return an artwork to aesthetic and physical wholeness. And what it reminded me of in particular, when I looked at this again, was how purposeful placement can be by an artist when they're creating an image, and therefore how important it was to return that physical and aesthetic wholeness to this piece, because all of those edge losses are so distracting. And so the treatment that involved choosing an appropriate paper that was similar to the original and carefully creating what we call inserts, the pieces of new paper that get added to the edges, and then carefully introducing water in the form of moisture vapor into the whole paper structure to relax it and flatten it and create results that I think really show this artist's watercolor to best advantage. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so I, just for the first time last week, had a chance to visit the Smithsonian Museum for the first time since the pandemic. And Kate showed me around the London Conservation Center where she works. So could you talk a little bit about what the center does?
Yes, happy to. We opened the London Conservation Center back in 2006 when the museum reopened after a major multi-year renovation of the entire building. And at the London Center, which occupies 2 floors, we have labs that are devoted to frames, works on paper, objects, which consists of a variety of 3-dimensional works, and paintings. We also have a lab for time-based media at another Smithsonian building up the street. But we have a display that's related to time-based media on the upper level of the London Conservation Center. So I'd like to encourage anyone in the DC area or any of you who visit to take advantage of this truly unique opportunity to see conservators working behind our floor-to-ceiling glass walls, and to come on the tours that we are starting to give once again. Well, Ben, I've spoken a little bit about art conservation, and I'd like to hear more from you about conserving the monuments.
Yeah, so, I think broadly speaking, preservation is our mission, right? Preserving these sites in perpetuity. And that's our commitment to the American people and to the fallen who are buried there and their loved ones. And we use art pretty powerfully in this. And what I'm showing you here is, we were born out of World War I, but World War II happens, and it quickly becomes apparent that, ABMC's mission is not over. And so after World War II, we have a similar process where next to kin are offered the choice of repatriation or overseas burial, resulting in the creation of 14 World War II cemeteries with over 90,000 burials. But what we see for World War II is that because the war is so huge in scope and geographic spread, that there's no real attempt to do a monument program the way we had our 11 monuments for World War I. And so to replace that, for World War II, the cemeteries are both cemeteries and monuments, which result in much more elaborate use of artwork in the World War II sites versus the World War I sites, specifically at least one major piece of sculpture work at each site. So I've got a couple examples here. On the left is the statue of youth triumphing over evil from Brittany American Cemetery. And on the right is the spirit of American youth rising from the waves, which is the major sculpture work at Normandy American Cemetery, sitting right over top the bluffs of Omaha Beach. And so, on one level, we preserve these sites on a day-to-day basis, right? We keep the grass green. We keep these sites beautifully intact. We keep the crosses white. We replace them as they need to be. But there's also these are cemeteries and monuments that we want to last forever. And so occasionally we have bigger projects. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to give a brief example of one of the preservation projects we've had to do recently, which is the mosaic at Epinal American Cemetery, which was starting to deteriorate. And so, we had to go in and fix a number of things. And I'm straying a bit outside my expertise as a military historian here, but I'll do my best. But there were cracks starting to develop. And so you can see we actually had to inject and fill the cracks. And then you can see the touch paint up job on the left image there. And then we also restored the entire mosaic by cleaning it. We applied a layer of latex over the entire top and then peeled it off, restoring it to kind of how it looked when it was originally made. And so if you go to the next slide, all the results of this effort, this is what we end up with. So, preservation is something that is extremely important to our mission, just like at the Smithsonian. And so I think, we're about at the point in the presentation where I want to turn it back over to Kelly and see if we have any questions from the audience before we have to wrap up.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, we have a number of questions coming in from the audience. First, I'll ask, what question would you ask Claggett Wilson about his war painting?
I would like to ask him how he felt when those original works were lost during transport, how he felt, and then maybe not what motivated. I think I could guess what motivated him to recreate them, but what that process was like for him, and hear more about that.
Yeah, I think I would say, my question for him would be kind of twofold. Is what do you get out of these paintings? What is your goal for painting these? How does this help you, kind of deal with and process your own experience? And then on the flip side of that, what do you want the viewers to take away? Because a viewer might not take away necessarily what Claggett Wilson thought. And then I would, probably ask him what that shape in the bottom right corner is.
Kate, there's some questions coming in about matting and framing. One audience member asked, how do we know that, for example, the lower left portion of the artwork where the figure is would not need a little bit more space. In general, adding a mat, is there kind of a challenge in how to present the work? And then kind of similarly, you can address both at the same time. One audience member notes that they found it interesting that their response to the painting was pretty different without the matting and framing, just presented on the slide, to how it then appeared when you were looking at it in storage.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, certainly the mats, the matting and framing serves a dual purpose. It's really the last step in our conservation, because it's so important to choose the highest quality materials in contact with works on paper. And then we want to show them to best advantage. So the aesthetics are equally important. And we make our decisions about how we mat something and whether we cover the edges, that's called overmatting, or whether we float a work of art. We make that kind of decision collaboratively with our curators and designers, and we weigh both the intended appearance, like what we think maximizes the visual appearance, but also the physical nature of the artwork. And many of these works were painted on paper boards that, while they had a facing paper that was very high quality, some of them had wood pulp containing paper boards, had inner cores, so they were somewhat brittle. So we did decide to overmat the edges, to just slightly cover the edges of all of them. And that made them more secure for travel as well.
Great, thanks, Kate. Ben, your discussion of World War I cemeteries has one audience member wondering what happened to those cemeteries during World War II. Was there any destruction that required rebuilding?
Yeah, so World War I and World War II, by the nature, one of the things about our World War I sites is that they were chosen for a number of reasons. The beauty of the surroundings, the accessibility to visitors, but one of the main considerations was the connection of where they were to the course of the fighting that Americans participated in, which you see with Ain Marne, with its, right at the foot of Belleau Wood. And so by the nature of World War II, a lot of the fighting goes over World War I battlefields. And so we do have to evacuate the cemeteries twice. We evacuate them during the German invasion of France in 1940. After France surrenders, the staff goes back and administers them until tensions between America and Germany escalate in 41, and we evacuate them again. And they're cared for throughout the war by their local staff. We have American superintendents, but the gardeners, the masons who work at these sites are locals, and so they actually take care of them throughout the war. There is some damage because they're located on battlefields. There's some unintentional damage from the fighting that goes through. Ain Marne is the chapel is shot up pretty well. All that's repaired after the war, except for one shell hole at Ain Marne that is left as kind of a marker to show visitors that this place was not just from World War I, that it was fought over in World War II. The only deliberate destruction we had was our naval monument at Brest is blown up by the Germans. Actually, before America enters the war, they claim that the Allies, the British, are using it as basically a landmark to help their bombers navigate, and so they blow it up. We have to rebuild it after the war. And then there's some relatively uncommon isolated destruction by German troops of Star of David headstones, for obvious reasons. For the most part, though, that is actually pretty rare. And in the cases where it does happen at Meuse-Argonne, the German commander, puts a guard on the cemetery to prevent any further damage. And you see that at several of our sites that are under German occupation, largely because of, the recognition between soldiers, even on opposing sides, of the valor of their enemies from the previous war.
Thanks, Ben. The next question is, Wilson's paintings are not documentary records of wartime reality, but what does art reveal that something like journalism maybe does not about war, emotional experiences, times of trauma?
Wow, I think that's a very deep question. It's sort of the question, I think, when you come to Wilson's works. And of course, I can't come to any kind of an answer with the experience that Ben has had. But I do think that it's a combination of the artist processing an experience, and in so doing, making the decisions about how to also present that experience with the knowledge that those works are going to be shared. I mean, the war portfolio was displayed, and there was even a book that was made of it, and it garnered praise in Time magazine. So while I don't know all the history, I think there was an intention to share it. So
Yeah,
I think hear what Ben has to say.
I think it's a great question. You know, in many ways, war is an unreplicable event, and the experience of being in war, being in battle, and being exposed to the bursting of a heavy shell is something that cannot be conveyed in its full power. And you could write paragraphs and paragraphs in text trying to describe it as a journalist or a historian, but so much of what happens is war is not just factual, but emotional and visceral. And I think in some ways art is much better to capture that, even if it's still, you know, a pale capture compared to the reality, is better positioned to capture that than dry text. And I say that as a guy who spent my career writing dry text to try and describe past military events. But you know, my work at ABMC, and specifically my work with Smithsonian over the last couple of years, has helped me understand how powerful art can be in, you know, I think, better conveying that to people who weren't there.
Thank you both for those really insightful responses. Before we close today, I want to give you the opportunity for any last words, closing remarks about Wilson's work and all that you've spoken to us about today. I'll let Kate start.
All right. Well, I do feel inspired after preparing for this program and seeing these works through Ben's eyes, and also Kelly seeing them through your eyes, and you know, applying some means of inquiry. I feel inspired to go back and to look at the rest of the works and to learn more about the artist as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this presentation, as well as, you know, kind of the partnership that American Battle Monuments Commission and Smithsonian American Art Museum have had, I think is very powerful and has been very helpful for me of gaining a greater understanding both of art and of what our sites do and how they do it. And I think preservation is key to that. And it's been fascinating to learn about the technical side of preservation for paper. And it's just, I think it's so important to me that, you know, that work is so important to preserve, you know, the art that SAAM holds, and that we at ABMC have preservation as one of our, you know, important missions, really the core of our mission. And I think, you know, we're coming up next year will be our centennial. We'll have been around as an agency for 100 years. The World War I sites have been around, you know, as temporary cemeteries even longer than that, and as permanent cemeteries for over 90 years. And I think, you know, preservation has been key to getting to us to 100 years, and will get us to the next 100 and the next 100 after that. And so this has been, I think, for me, very valuable in seeing some other ways that art is preserved and, you know, memories of this war is preserved.
Well, thank you so much, Kate and Ben. This is absolutely fascinating. It's so great to explore American art through these different lenses and disciplines. I also want to thank the behind the scenes team at the museum for helping produce this program. And finally, I'll just ask you, our audience, who I really appreciate being here, please fill out the survey to let us know what you enjoyed about today's program. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Double Take. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.